This is a Fox News alert. I'm Chris Wallace in for Brett Baer. We are awaiting word from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on its decision about President Trump's immigration executive order. That order, which temporarily limits travel from 7 largely Muslim countries and suspends all refugees from coming to the U.S., has been blocked by a federal judge. Now we're told a ruling from a 3-judge panel reviewing the court order is coming down shortly, perhaps in this hour. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts begins our coverage tonight. Good evening, John.
And when we get that ruling, Chris, and it could be any time between now and probably 8 o'clock Eastern time, it's expected to be a very narrow ruling. This will deal only with the temporary restraining order against the president's immigration ban that was imposed by Judge James Robart. He is a district judge of the federal court in Seattle a week ago. Now, there's a number of things that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals could do. It could lift the temporary restraining order altogether. It could keep it in place, or it could lift parts of it. If the White House does prevail at the 9th, it's expected to immediately reinstate the immigration ban. But if it loses, we do not know, and no one can tell me tonight, whether they will go to the Supreme Court to appeal the temporary restraining order, or if they will simply go back and fight this case on the merits of its constitutionality at the district court in Seattle. At the White House today, it was another conflict-filled day as the president was hitting back against his critics.
So thank you all very much for being here.
The president again ripped Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal today, insisting Blumenthal wasn't truthful when talking about what Judge Neil Gorsuch told him in a private meeting yesterday.
Ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record. He misrepresented that, just like he misrepresented Judge Gorsuch.
Aides to Judge Gorsuch say he told Blumenthal that attacks against members of the judiciary are, quote, disheartening and demoralizing. Contrary to what Blumenthal claims, those aides say Gorsuch was talking in general terms and not responding to attacks the president has leveled against a district judge in Washington state and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Today, Senator Blumenthal was sticking to his story.
I am simply repeating what Judge Gorsuch said to me, and I hope he will repeat it in even stronger terms.
At the White House today, it was all sweetness and light as other Democratic senators came over for lunch to discuss the Supreme Court nominee. Most of those senators are up for re-election in 2018 in states that President Trump won handily.
I am so encouraged to have this type of a meeting, and we're all invited to sit down and be open and honest about it. And no one got into name calling, or no one got into why he said, she said. It wasn't that, and you'd be surprised. Not only did we talk about the nominee for Supreme Court, we talked about many, many subjects.
But lunch was only a brief calm in what seems like a daily Twitter storm. The president also lashing out again at Senator John McCain after McCain dismissed President Trump's claim that the raid in Yemen that took the life of Navy SEAL Ryan Owens was a success. The president ripped McCain, writing Senator McCain should not be talking about the success or failure of a mission to the media. Only emboldens the enemy. He's been losing so long he doesn't know how to win anymore. Just look at the mess our country is in, bogged down in conflict all over the place. When asked about the president's attack, McCain deferred.
I rely to a large degree on the national security team that I am very good friends with for many years. General Mattis, General Flynn, General Kelly.
But his Democratic colleagues were only too happy to leap in.
When President Trump assaults Senator McCain, he better watch out, because this is a guy who knows what he's talking about.
He's saying so many things that are not fact-based that I don't know if anyone believes him anymore.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning.
President Trump also discovered today he can move markets, the Dow taking off on a rocket ride after telling airline CEOs a tax cut is coming.
We're going to be announcing something, I would say, over the next 2 or 3 weeks that will be phenomenal.
And a victory for the president today after weeks of delays, finally presiding over the swearing in of his Attorney General, Senator Jeff Sessions. Immediately signing 3 executive orders to crack down on criminals and help protect those in the front lines of fighting crime. But the White House was forced to rein in one of the president's closest advisors today. Kellyanne Conway appeared to step over an ethical line while defending the president's daughter, Ivanka.
Go buy Ivanka's stuff is what I would tell you. I hate shopping. I'm going to go get some on myself today.
The chairman of the House Committee on Government Oversight called that unacceptable. The White House saw it that way, too.
Do you believe that she crossed an ethical line? Kellyanne has been counseled, and that's all we're going to go with.
And Kellyanne Conway may not be out of the woods just yet. We hear that the Office of Government Ethics is going to review her statements. And the feud with Senator John McCain over the raid in Yemen is not over yet either. Fox News has learned that Vice President Pence will pick up that baton. In a speech to the cadets at West Point this hour, in remarks exclusively obtained by Fox News, the Vice President is expected to say, quote, "We will always support you, not second guess you, and we will never call your service or your sacrifice a failure." Chris?
John, let's get back to our top story. What's the White House saying ahead of this ruling tonight by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals? Could we see the president react to the ruling, either if it goes for him or against him? And I don't just mean on Twitter.
Yeah, I don't think, Chris, that we'll see him react to that in person. There's no more photo opportunities for him tonight. They don't have any plan for him to come out. Likely that we'll get a paper statement from the White House. And, of course, we could always hear from him on Twitter. Now with Jeff Sessions sworn in as Attorney General, he is the one who will be leading the charge in the courts against this. And I don't think they have made up their mind just yet whether or not they would take this to the Supreme Court if they get an unfavorable ruling at the Ninth Circuit. We should find out maybe later on tonight. Chris?
John Roberts with a whole lot of news from the Trump White House tonight. John, thank you.
Thanks.
While it seems President Trump is being criticized from all sides, the West Coast may be ground zero for the anti-Trump movement, at least by government officials there. Correspondent Dan Springer has that story tonight from Seattle.
I'm filing a lawsuit today in federal court against President Trump.
With its lawsuit against President Donald Trump's extreme vetting executive order, Washington State fired the first legal salvo from any state capital, aimed at derailing the Trump administration. At least from the West Coast, it would appear this is the first of many. Washington's Democratic Governor Jay Inslee joined the protesters at the Seattle airport, and critics say took hyperbole to a new level. Oregon's Kate Brown, the country's first openly bisexual governor, protested Trump in the Women's March, declared Oregon a sanctuary state, then sent a mass email inviting people to join her newly formed Trump resistance team. She wrote, "Now more than ever, we must bring communities together to resist in a divided nation."
I am deeply disturbed by all of this. We should all be deeply disturbed.
The state's Republican Party shot back, saying this kind of rhetoric by a sitting Oregon governor is inflammatory, divisive, and unprecedented. And in California, where the Democratic-controlled legislature hired former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder to thwart the Trump agenda, Governor Jerry Brown says he'll fight on many fronts, from immigration to the environment.
We can't fall back and give in to the climate deniers. The science is clear. The danger is real.
Some argue that governors are just doing what their voters want. Trump lost the left coast to Hillary Clinton by more than 4 million votes and 26 percentage points. But he did win 80 of the 133 counties.
When you're elected as the governor of the state, you're elected not just to represent the voters who voted for you, but the people, all of the people of the state.
The West Coast states could take the role Texas played during the Obama administration. It filed 48 lawsuits, defeating the president's plan to ease the threat of deportations for some illegal immigrants, losing on blocking Syrian refugees, and still fighting 20 cases, including the Clean Power Plan. Against Trump, the blue wall will also likely have some legal victories, but there also could be a cost.
They're going to further alienate Americans by suggesting just how far to the left the Democrat Party is tilted. They know that from Bernie Sanders' success during the campaign and from Hillary Clinton's failure.
Governor Inslee's office says he has been in direct discussions with the governors of Oregon and California about how to respond to the overall Trump agenda. Outside of this travel ban lawsuit, there's been nothing concrete, but they are watching the promise, and they promise to act as soon as the appeal of Obamacare takes place. Chris?
Well, Dan, as we know, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is set to announce its ruling on President Trump's travel ban sometime this evening. And the lawsuit, of course, started there in Washington State. Are they gearing up for a fight?
Well, if this is any indication, the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, has already said that he will have a news conference the minute that this decision is handed down. I would expect that his office and Governor Jay Inslee will fight this as far as they're allowed. Chris?
Dan Springer reporting from Seattle. Dan, thanks for that. The increasingly partisan marathon known as confirmation of the Trump cabinet seems to be winding down. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Emanuel has that story tonight from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Mike.
Well, Chris, good evening to you. Democrats appear unable to stop, only able to delay cabinet confirmations, so senators could be looking at another late night.
The Senate is poised to confirm the third member of the Trump cabinet this week.
The American people need Dr. Tom Price applying his practical knowledge as a doctor and a legislator at the Department of Health and Human Services, an agency in great need of new leadership.
However, it's been a bruising week on Capitol Hill with several all-nighters on the Senate floor, and Democrats determined to burn 30 hours on each of these cabinet nominees.
And we continue to see the Democrats in the Senate trying to slow down everything, including picking fights in battles they will not win, and they know it.
With all indications that Republicans have the votes to get Price tonight and Steve Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary confirmed by early next week, now Democrats have set their targets on fast food chief executive Andrew Puzder for Labor Secretary.
President Trump made a clear commitment on the campaign trail to put workers first. So I have to say I was deeply disappointed when Andrew Puzder's nomination was announced.
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer has called on the nominee to withdraw.
Andrew Puzder has proven himself to be an enemy, not a champion, of workers' rights. Nominating Puzder to oversee the Labor Department is clearly having a fox guard the henhouse, and a pretty sharp-toothed fox at that.
While Republicans have complained about this being the slowest cabinet confirmation process since George Washington, there has been a practical impact. All of the floor time spent arguing over these nominees has held up work on repealing and replacing Obamacare and tax reform, top priorities of President Trump and the GOP Congress.
Republicans set a 200-day goal of repealing and replacing Obamacare and finishing tax reform by August. That won't be easy in the Senate with a Supreme Court nomination in the mix as well. Chris?
Mike, as we await that decision from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on President Trump's travel ban, what's the sense on Capitol Hill about where this is headed?
We had Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly up here a couple of days ago telling lawmakers he regretted not delaying the rollout a couple of days to brief top leaders here on Capitol Hill. That obviously goes over well with congressional leaders. Republicans say it was perfectly legitimate to pause and take a closer look at immigration from those 7 countries, a temporary ban. Democrats were quick to label it a Muslim ban, and so like many things these days, the two sides are divided. Chris.
Mike Emanuel reporting from Capitol Hill. Mike, thanks. We now have a Fox News alert. We have gotten word from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. They have upheld the lower court ruling from Washington State putting a temporary restraining order on President Trump's travel ban, the ban that limited travel from 7 largely Muslim countries into the U.S. by anybody trying to visit, and also suspension of all travel by refugees into this country, especially from Syria, an indefinite stay there. So, again, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld the lower court ruling suspending President Trump's ban. There had been some indications in the very critical questions that judges asked the government lawyer in the case that they had some real doubts about the government's argument that this was a key case, but you can know that this is now going to become a huge issue. President Trump said, and his supporters said, that he was acting well within his powers as president to make decisions about immigration, which is specifically granted to him in the Constitution, and also to make decisions about national security, and that he felt to continue this travel from these 7 largely Muslim countries and to continue the entry by refugees into the country was a threat to national security. Now the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is saying that it is not persuaded by that, and therefore the temporary restraining order on the president's travel ban stays in order. Now the question is, from the White House, will President Trump appeal this to the Supreme Court, or will he let the temporary restraining order stand and go back to the lower court in the federal district court in Washington state and argue again about the merits of this? Remember, all the judge did in that case, it's a lot, but all he did was put a temporary restraining order to stop enforcement of the travel ban by President Trump. Now that restraint, that temporary restraining order, stays in effect. Let me ask my producer, where are we going to go here on this? Pardon? Let me say it again. I'm sorry. Okay, we're trying to get a reaction from some of our legal experts to this. In the meantime, why don't we tell you what news we have? The markets like the talk about a tax cut that Mike reported on moments ago, that talk from President Trump about putting out a major tax cut within weeks. The Dow jumped 118 points, the S&P 500 rose 13, and NASDAQ was up 33 points. Meanwhile, more than 12.2 million people signed up for Obamacare in the most recent enrollment period. That is far fewer than the 13.8 million predicted by the Obama administration, and it is 4% lower than last year. One of the problems President Trump is facing in his early days on the job is a flood of leaks from within the president's own administration. Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howie Kurtz, is here tonight to talk about that. Howie, before we get to this question of leaks, let me ask you for your reaction to this quite stunning news. Not, I can't say surprising, but still stunning, that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has sided with a federal judge over President Trump and has upheld his temporary restraining order suspending President Trump's travel ban for immigrants from 7 largely Muslim nations, as well as immigrants coming into this, refugees coming into this country.
I don't think the ruling itself was a shock, Chris, given the indication of the questioning by the judges, as you mentioned. But I think it is part of a much larger battle now between President Trump and the judiciary that also has gotten Judge Gorsuch's nomination caught up in it, because based on past performance, it seems very likely the president will sharply criticize this. But this is the way the process works when you're president and not the CEO of a company. You can't just do whatever you want. You're subject to all these legal constraints. But I think this ratchets up even further the president's contention that this is going to put the country in danger because he can't do what he wants right away. And those who believe in an independent judiciary are going to push back hard. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot of pushback from the Democrats as well.
Howie, let me get back to you about the reason you were here, which was the leaks. But we now have our chief judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, on the phone. And, Judge, I'd like your reaction to the ruling by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upholding the temporary restraining order.
Well, my reaction is similar to what we just heard from Howie, which is that the court, in a very, very narrow ruling, narrow reading of the preconditions for the appeal that the president's lawyers filed, concluded that they're unlikely to prevail on the merits, and therefore there's no reason to lift to this day. In my view, they inadequately addressed the primacy of the presidency when it comes to establishing foreign policy, and instead stayed in the weeds on the rules.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. You made a very important point there, Judge, because to continue a temporary restraining order, a court has to say that there is a likelihood that when they actually deal with this on the merits, that in fact they are going to succeed. And when the lower court judge did that, he was saying basically the attorneys general of Washington State and others who were parties to the lawsuit were likely to succeed when it came to the issue of whether or not this this travel ban was legal. And now not only is he saying that they were likely to succeed and therefore he issued the temporary restraining order, but now the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is saying that they are likely to succeed on the merits when they get to the underlying issue, which is, of course, the constitutionality of the president's travel ban.
And all of this, Chris, in the face of language which the president read aloud correctly and clearly and word for word in a speech he gave to the National Police Chiefs Association yesterday, which directly authorizes him and every president since Harry Truman to do what he did. So his frustration is palpable. His criticism of the court for dwelling into the weeds and the politics is well grounded. And of course, we're going to be hearing a lot about this. His opportunities now are severely limited. He can ask the Ninth Circuit to sit en banc, which they don't do because there's 29 of them. They sit in panels of 10.
Let me just explain. En banc means that it wouldn't just be the 3-judge panel. It would be all the members of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
except that this Circuit Court of Appeals is so huge that they don't sit with all 29 members. They sit in groups of 9, 10, and 10. So the 3 who ruled against him would be joined by another 7, and those 10 would address it anew on its way, presumably, to the Supreme Court. The Justice Department, which finally has an Attorney General, could decide to bypass the en banc request and go direct to what we now know is a hopelessly and equally ideologically divided Supreme Court.
Well, Judge, stand by, because I want to bring in John Roberts, who's at the White House, and may be able to shed some clarity. First of all, John, any reaction? It's just been a matter of moments to the Ninth Circuit Court's ruling. And, of course, that big question, what is President Trump going to do now?
Yeah, there is no reaction just yet. I dropped by the office here on my way out, and I was told, what have you got? And they said, stand by. So we should be getting something very soon. We've been monitoring Twitter as well. There's been nothing from the president. And Jeff Sessions, who's just sworn in as the Attorney General a few hours ago, you can bet is working furiously on this. We don't know if they will, as the judge was talking about, appeal this to an en banc session of the Ninth Circuit, if they plan on taking it further than that to the Supreme Court. I was told earlier that Justice Kennedy is the justice who oversees the Ninth Circuit. They know the ideological split 4-4 in the Supreme Court, and it may not be worth it to them to take it all the way to the Supreme Court and lose on the temporary restraining order and then have an injunction put in place while this whole thing goes to the district court. So it may be, Chris, that the strategy that's developing right now is to just let that temporary restraining order stay in place, go to the district court in Seattle and fight this on the merits. Don't forget there's 2 constitutional challenges, one in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, another under the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. The White House, the president, believes that they can win on the merits of this case because U.S. law lays out there pretty clear that the president has the ability to suspend certain classes of aliens or all aliens, third-party aliens, from coming into this country, as long as they're not trying to suspend legal permanent residence, which they're not, for purposes of national security. So they believe that they're on solid ground when it comes to the law. They think they can prevail if they do try this in the courts. They wanted to get this temporary restraining order lifted because they don't want there to be a period here between now and when the eventual court case is determined where somebody who wants to do harm to people in this country can take advantage of this hole, of this window being open, and get into the country before that window is closed again. There's also the chance, though, they could lose in district court. Then it goes to the appellate court. That case would eventually go to the Supreme Court. There's no doubt about that, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about those, though, because they have some tough choices here. On the one hand, if they go to the Supreme Court, and as we know, that it's an 8-member court, 8-justice court now, and let's say there is a liberal-conservative split, 4-4, on a tie, then the lower court ruling, in this case the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, continues. And that means that, as you say, they'd go to the court, there'd be a tie, and it wouldn't have gotten them anything because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals would stay, the fact that they have upheld the lower court ruling. On the other hand, if you go to the lower court, isn't that a process that's going to take some months?
Oh, it will take months, no question about that. And for it to eventually get to the Supreme Court, it could potentially take more than a year. I guess the government could probably petition for some sort of emergency hearing, but I really don't know that much about the law to know if they could do that or not. But you're right. If they go back to district court, it'll be weeks before this case is heard. It could potentially take months for the case to go through the district court and then through the Court of Appeals. And then the Supreme Court would have to agree, first of all, to hear it, which I'm sure the president's got enough sway that they would. But this could potentially delay the president's order from taking place for a long, long time. And again, the president has warned that there are people who are trying to get into this country to do this country and citizens of this country harm, and might they take advantage of this potential and this opening to be able to get into the country so that they can plot and plan, Chris.
And
you're going to hear him talk a lot about that, I can tell you, in the coming days.
And John, John, I was going to say, all of this decision today and all of our analysis about it comes, again, in the backdrop of President Trump's very barely concealed fury at the fact that this is going on. When he talked about it in front of those sheriffs, he talked about that this is something that a dim-witted high school student could figure out, and some of the arguments that were being advanced in the Circuit Court of Appeals hearing were disgraceful. So you've got to know that on a personal level, here is the president in a court challenge less than 3 weeks into office, and his power as president on an issue of such basic mandate as his ability to regulate and control and enforce immigration has been questioned by a court of appeals.
And particularly, too, when you look at the fact that when he was at that Sheriff's Association meeting and talking to the sheriffs and the police chiefs, he read out the statute, and he took about 5 minutes to read out the statute as well, and he said he thought it was clearly written, it was beautifully written. He would have added a he or she to the powers of the presidency, as he joked with the crowd there, and he had mentioned it earlier in the Roosevelt Room when he was meeting with a group of sheriffs, or the previous day actually, when he said he really can't believe that he's in court arguing this sort of thing. He firmly believes that the power of the Constitution and U.S. law gives the president the authority to decide matters of immigration without being questioned by either the courts or the states. But he's finding out quickly that the courts and the states can in fact question him. So I would expect that we're going to probably hear a very terse reaction from the White House, and then when the president gets on Twitter either later tonight or tomorrow, I think he's probably going to rip a few people, I would think.
Well, John, thanks so much for your coverage. Obviously, let us know if you get any more developments from the White House.
Sure will. We should expect something soon, I think, Chris.
Good. And I should tell you, we have our panel standing by. We're going to talk to them all in just a moment. But first, I want to go to Dan Springer out in Seattle. And while we've all been talking about it on the East Coast, this fight started on the West Coast. Of course, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals based in San Francisco. What reaction have you heard, if any, to the Ninth Circuit's ruling?
Well, we haven't heard any yet, but I'm sure they're celebrating at Bob Ferguson's office. He's the Attorney General here, and he filed this thing 3 days after it was issued by President Trump. In fact, it was 2 days after the governor of the state himself attended a rally and a protest down at SeaTac, the airport in Seattle. So this state government here in Washington was looking at this and working on this lawsuit immediately after it was issued by President Trump. I want to just bring in one thing that I saw in the opinion today, and that is standing. You know, we talked a lot about over the last couple of days whether or not Washington is a third party or if it was actually injured by this. Well, the court decided that they were actually injured, and that's because they have state universities, including University of Washington and Washington State, that had dozens and dozens of students and faculty who were trapped overseas or couldn't get over there or couldn't get back. And so the court decided that that was a third-party injury that was significant enough because it impacted the state's ability to run its university. So that's how they decided that standing was granted in this case. But yeah, Bob Ferguson is holding a news conference. I'm sure it's going to be going pretty soon here, and they'll be very happy in Washington State, government at least, with this decision by the court.
I have to say, Dan, that's pretty stunning, the idea. Here is the President of the United States saying that the security of this country depends on a temporary suspension of travel from these countries, a temporary suspension of refugees coming into the country. And here is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals saying Washington has standing because of the interests of state universities and hundreds of students there. That is a pretty interesting conclusion. Let me just briefly reset the situation, and that is that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has handed down its ruling. It has upheld the temporary restraining order from that federal judge in Washington that has, as I say, a temporary restraining order stopping President Trump's executive order limiting travel from 7 largely Muslim nations and from all refugees coming into the country, an indefinite suspension of refugees from Syria. He said it was a matter of national security until they could figure out a more effective extreme vetting measure to be able to tell who was coming into the country and whether they meant us harm or not. Let's bring in our panel to discuss these stunning developments. Lisa Booth, columnist with the Washington Examiner, Julie Pace, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. I'm sure, Julie, you have been on your little machine there trying to find out
right
what.
Next to me.
Any reaction?
No reaction yet. I'm in the same boat as John Roberts right now. We expected this to come down a little bit later this evening, so this caught a lot of people by surprise. But we are expecting something from the White House House soon. As John said, I think we're probably going to have the official reaction and then the presidential Twitter reaction. But more broadly, beyond what the White House just says today, I mean, this is a big blow to the president in his first month in office. You usually don't see this kind of check on presidential power this early in a presidency, although certainly this case will go on through the legal system.
What did they expect? In other words, there had been comments, and you could tell it in President Trump's remarks after the hearing, after he had listened in on the hearing. He was pretty contemptuous of the lawyers, the three judges in that Court of Appeals panel. Did they think this was going to go against him?
They weren't really trying to make predictions on it, but certainly they listened to the audio that we all heard when these judges were being pretty tough on the government lawyer in trying to get to the heart of the matter. I think the argument that you're going to see from the White House going forward, we're already starting to hear this broadly, is that presidents, and this is true, have a lot of sway over national security decisions. I think as this goes forward in the court system, you're going to hear them try to back up that argument that this is the president of the United States using intelligence information that he has to try to protect national security.
Of course, one of and let me bring Lisa into this, one of the counter arguments there was the judge, and again, you know, there is some interesting facts here. Here's a judge in a federal district court in Washington state arguing with the president about national security, but he said there's no evidence that any of the people from these 7 countries have committed fatal terrorist attacks, and that the argument about national security doesn't hold much weight.
Well, I think for the Trump administration, the hastiness has really hurt the administration, whether it was the chaos over green cards or the fact that they moved forward with this without having the Supreme Court nominee in place. And I think we've seen a lot of tension in Congress, and that's only going to escalate because the Democratic Party right now is going to be looking for any wins that they can get. They can certainly point to this as a win, exploit this as a win. And it's also going to further hurt President Trump as he tries to move forward both his cabinet nominees as well as the Supreme Court nominee as well.
I mean, when you think of the fact that President Trump so clearly came in and some of his top people came in as disruptors, they were going to shake up Washington, they were going to change the system, and they were going to, as the president said, there's a new sheriff in town. He just got a full stop sign, a red light from a district court judge in Washington and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people voted for President Trump because they wanted that disruption, they wanted that change, they wanted some of the things that he, said that he was going to do, drain the swamp, if you will. But there's also checks and balances to that as well, and we're obviously seeing that play out in the courts as well. And I think we'll also see that play out in Congress as well. I mean, right now he's sort of moved forward just with executive actions, but at some point he's going to have to govern. He's going to have to work with Congress to move legislation forward. So we're going to see some of those checks and balances play out here in the next few months, and as we're witnessing tonight as well.
Charles? Something, isn't it? That's my question for you.
It's good that you keep it open-ended.
Yes.
Because I got a lot to say.
Go.
Look, the new sheriff has discovered that unlike Dodge City in Washington, there are other pre-existing institutions, and he's just run into one. Now, I think the judge, the district court judge, in saying that the threat is not what the president thinks it is way overstepping his bounds. His job is not to decide, to weigh the national security issues having to do with immigration. I happen to agree with the judge, but that doesn't matter. The president has the constitutional authority to decide. He may have decided wrongly, but he has the authority, and the judge, I think, was wrong. I don't think there's anybody who should be surprised that he was upheld by the Ninth Circuit. It's the most overturned, most left-wing court in the country. I just hope that the administration was ready for this with a contingency plan. I will remind you that when the district judge ruled against the administration, they did not file a brief for 24 hours. It should have been ready in 10 minutes to be handed over. And I hope they have, now that they have an attorney general at least in place, they have a strategy for what they're going to do. And my advice would be, don't go to the Supreme Court, because it'll bounce back.
Because there'll be a tie?
It'll be a tie. You're not going to get anywhere. You'll be back in the ninth. Go back to the district court. And I suspect, as a pure, cynical political ploy, why not have it as an issue? You'll blame the court if anything happens. You'll be able to say you're being stymied. You need to have a fifth justice on the court. For political, raw, cynical reasons, I think it would be advantageous to let the stay stand. I don't know what they're going to decide, but they should have a contingency plan ready as of yesterday.
But, you know, I was going to say, regardless of the merits of this argument, the idea that courts can sit there and say, your argument about national security doesn't persuade us, that's happened before. During the Bush administration, there were several decisions after 9/11 that President Bush made, and the Supreme Court several times said, no, you've gone too far here, you've got to stop.
It's not that unusual, but it is unusual for it to happen in the first 10 days of a new administration.
Well, I assume unprecedented.
And remember, with Obama, the temporary stay on his immigration, the legalization of the 5 million illegal immigrants in the country, was stayed by a district judge in Texas and remained in place up until today, until the time ran out for Obama and it effectively died. So this happens on all sides. But, you know, Trump himself, with his tweets and his anger and his responses, has elevated this to an issue where it's monopolizing our show as if it was like the handing of the 10 Commandments from Sinai. It's a ruling from the Ninth Circuit that everybody should have expected.
Well, and that's an interesting question, Julie, because some people have criticized this president for getting into this fight so early. You're exactly right. This is going to dominate the news for days now, maybe weeks. Meanwhile, the president had an agenda. I mean, first of all, we have to admit he's going against a very obstructionist Democratic Party in the Senate, but he has an agenda on Obamacare, on tax reform, which he talked about today, on infrastructure, on funding the government, on building the wall. Does this all get caught up and slowed down, tied up because of this fight?
I think to some extent it will. You will see movement on separate tracks legislatively with health care.
Let me just interrupt for a second because, no surprise, President Trump has tweeted his reaction to the decision by the appeals court, and John Roberts has that tweet from the North Lawn. John.
Hey, Chris, good evening to you. I ran inside to try to figure out what they were doing. They're all behind closed doors trying to formulate the response. And, of course, as we could expect, the first response came out on Twitter. The president saying on his personal email, not the official at POTUS email, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake!" Exclamation point. Now, we can try to decipher what that means. Will we see you in an en-banc session of the Ninth Circuit, as Judge Napolitano was talking to you about? Will we see you in an emergency request to the Supreme Court? Or will we see you in district court in Seattle as we battle over this preliminary injunction? There's already a schedule set for those hearings. And then the broader question of what the constitutionality of this extreme vetting executive order is. So a little bit of a, I would say, less than thorough explanation of where they're going with this, but the president weighing in saying, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake!" Exclamation point. Chris?
Thank you so much, John, and obviously bring us up to date on any more information you'll get this hour. Let me bring in Judge Napolitano, Fox News chief judicial analyst. I'd like you to talk about this issue of the court trying to sort out, on the one hand, this is a court, not the president, saying we're not persuaded by the president's argument that this is a national security issue of so much urgency that you need to take this step.
It's precisely the wrong thing for the court to do, Chris, when you have the following observations, which are beyond dispute. The Constitution assigns the decision-making for foreign policy exclusively to the president. Even Congress has a subordinate role, subordinated to confirming ambassadors and ratifying treaties and paying for the State Department. The president has a lot of tools that the Congress has given him. One of the tools is the statute that he read yesterday, which we've all been talking about, which was exercised by President Carter and by President Obama, a blanket ban on immigrants from from given places. The statute specifically says the president on his own by proclamation, meaning he doesn't have to consult with anybody else, can make this decision. The decision to ban is not reviewable. It's not justiciable. Judges are incapable of second-guessing the president on it. So for that reason, he may be thinking the Supreme Court is going to invalidate this. I don't know which way the Supreme Court's going to go, and I don't know which court he had in mind. But this is an intellectually dishonest piece of work that the Ninth Circuit has produced tonight, because it essentially consists of substituting the judgment of 3 judges for the President of the United States when the Constitution unambiguously gives this area of jurisdiction, foreign policy, exclusively to the president.
But Judge, let me ask you directly about what I was just talking about here with the panel. I can't remember all of the details, but there were several cases that went to the Supreme Court after 9/11 involving enhanced interrogation, involving Guantanamo, and in those cases, the Supreme Court said that that President Bush had overstepped his bounds, and that they, as the court, were saying that what he had done was illegal. Why is this different, not on the merits, but on a matter of principle?
Okay, great question, Chris. You are speaking of 6 cases in which the Bush administration was challenged by detainees at Guantanamo Bay. It lost 5 of the 6. The one was on an issue because it was filed in the wrong court. The 5 that it lost all had the same issue at their base, and that is, if the government seeks to exercise its powers extraterritorially, like in Cuba, does the Constitution follow the government? And in all 5 cases, by different majorities and for different reasons, the conclusion was the same. The Constitution follows the government. This is precisely a different reason. This is not whether or not the Constitution governs the government. This is whether or not judges can interfere with the execution of an area of the Constitution which unambiguously gives the authority exclusively to the president. That's why this is so profoundly wrong. Let me add another gloss to this as to how complex it truly is when the president says in his inimitable way, "See you in court." There are 47 lawsuits, each in a different United States district court. This one in Seattle is just one of them. The Chief Justice of the United States, who bears the same name as our colleague John Roberts, should consolidate all of these, and he can do that this evening, and very well say it's not going to be tried by Judge Robart in Seattle. It's going to be tried by Judge Ammon in Brooklyn, because she also issued a nationwide injunction. So we're really in untested, untried, virginal territory here with a highly politicized Circuit Court of Appeals that assumed the powers of the presidency by second-guessing him and overruling him.
Just briefly, Judge, if he were to do that, whether it's in the Seattle court or the Brooklyn court or whatever court, how long, if you're now dealing with the merits, not the question of a temporary restraining order, how long does a case like that take? I mean, we're talking weeks or even months, aren't we?
Well, they could do it in an expedited fashion, but you're talking the shortest it could be is a couple of weeks. But the first order of business is this temporary restraining order. Judge Robarts entered the restraining order after 15 minutes of oral argument with minimal documents in front of him, with federal prosecutors utterly unprepared. And I don't blame them. The Justice Department didn't have Attorney General Sessions running it. They couldn't even decide who was going to go into court for them. I honestly expected the Ninth Circuit to send it back to Judge Robarts and say, give us a better record. Hold a hearing on this. Instead, they, for different reasons, ratified what he did.
Judge Napolitano will bring you in as we continue to try to figure out all of the legal and also obviously political ramifications of this. Back to the panel. Any more word from your sources?
No, and this is starting what has become kind of a familiar routine for White House reporters, where you get a tweet from the president and then you desperately start trying to get their aides on the phone and on email to try to figure out what's behind it, because see you in court is kind of provocative, but it doesn't provide us a lot of detail about what the administration's actual next steps are.
Do you think that he says this and then they try to catch up and figure out where he is and what this means?
A little bit. I think on something like this, to the point that Charles was making earlier, they certainly knew that this ruling was coming down and it was going to go one of two ways. So you have to imagine that they actually do have a game plan. They have Attorney General Sessions, who's now in place at the Justice Department after, about 12 hours on the job, will be taking the lead on this. But I do think that sometimes you see the president getting out ahead of where his advisors actually are in terms of a game plan.
Charles, I get this look on your face that you're not quite as confident that they have a game plan.
Well, look, I would note that the president was quick on the trigger, but we were quicker. No, I don't think they do. They have not had a game plan from the beginning on this. I'm not sure they were aware of his tweeting this. I'm not even sure the president himself knows to what level which court he's going to be going to. But he's simply saying, I'm not going to lay down and let this stand, and I'll fight it. But I think the point is well taken. At a point where he's trying to launch, it's a young administration about to launch an extremely ambitious agenda with a Congress waiting to enact it into law, everything from tax reform to infrastructure. This is a huge distraction, and it is almost criminally unnecessary. It did not have to be done this way. He did not have to impose the moratorium. He simply could have instructed his administration to do a new vetting process, accelerate it, present it, and he wouldn't have had any of this stuff and the bad publicity. So I think it's a self-inflicted wound, which unfortunately is going to hold back an administration that I think was doing well on a lot of other issues, concrete issues, and now it's going to get in the way.
Well, no surprise in this new world that we're living in. You've heard the tweet from President Trump. Now we have a tweet from the Democratic leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer. He says this: President Trump ought to see the writing on the wall, abandon proposal, roll up his sleeves, and come up with a real bipartisan plan to keep us safe. Charles, that sounds a little bit like what you just said.
He obviously is listening.
But not enough, right?
But I do think they would do well to not get caught up. This could be, as Obama would have said, a quagmire.
Let me bring in James Rosen, who's been watching all of this tonight. James, your thoughts about this and how big a setback it is to President Trump's ambitions for dramatic immigration reform.
Well, Chris, the Democratic National Committee rushed out a statement calling this a massive blow to the White House. That's debatable because while this particular executive order has attracted worldwide attention, its actual scope was very limited in terms of its impact on the immigration system. After all, most of the provisions in this executive order were temporary. You had a 120-day suspension on all refugees coming into the country. You have a 90-day suspension on immigrants from those 7 countries of high concern for terrorism. The only thing that was indefinite was on Syrian refugees, and given the state of Syria, that seems understandable. So this really amounted to only a kind of a temporary tinkering with the immigration system, and not the major component of Donald Trump's immigration policy that we can expect to see over the next few months and years. The major aspect of the president's immigration policy, of course, is the building of this wall along the southwest border, and also the increased police presence or law enforcement presence along that border. And there are other aspects to it, the deportation of criminal illegal aliens already in the country, the plans for the entire set of 11 million illegal immigrants in this country. So this executive order was a very limited portion of his immigration policy. The temporary suspension of the executive order being upheld by this court, as we all know, it's going to head to the Supreme Court, most likely. This was not the massive blow to President Trump's policies that, say, a Supreme Court ruling striking down Obamacare would have been to the Obama administration.
No, but it's not nothing when you're talking, 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, 20 days into an administration, James. I mean, this is still a significant blow to have this executive order and a court of appeals, whether it's right or wrong, for a court of appeals to slap them down.
When you mention the time frame, the fact that this is happening 3 weeks into the administration, again, that doesn't speak to the substantive policy implications. It only speaks to optics and politics. And earlier in this very panel, we heard the suggestion, I believe, from Charles Krauthammer, that this could be wonderful politics for Donald Trump, even if this case ultimately is lost, precisely because because it is so limited on the policy front.
All right, we're going to get Charles's reaction in a moment, but first, this is playing out, folks, in real time as we're talking this hour, and you've seen the White House, you've seen the Court of Appeals in San Francisco. It's also playing out where this whole case started in Seattle, where that federal district court judge put a temporary restraining order on the president's travel ban. Let's go back now to Dan Springer in Seattle. Dan, I understand we're getting a reaction from Washington's governor to the ruling by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah, and we're still waiting for something on camera. He's supposed to live stream his comments from Olympia any time now. We're also waiting for Bob Ferguson, the Attorney General who filed this lawsuit on last Monday. We're waiting for his news conference. We have a camera out there waiting for the doors to open up so we can get in there and hear what Bob Ferguson has to say. We expect to hear a lot of the same stuff that we heard after Judge Robart's decision last Friday. But we do have a statement now from the governor, and among other things he says, I'm proud that Washington is a national leader in this fight. We were the first state to stand against this executive order, but all Americans need to be willing to stand and fight for our democracy everywhere, every time, and in every way that it is threatened. I will say, just adding to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and stuff that's already been said about it being the most appealed and overturned court in the land, I did a little research, and in 2012, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States, 86% of the cases that it looked at, that it reviewed from the Ninth Circuit that year, it overturned. By far and away, more cases overturned than any other district court or appellate court. So they have a long way to go yet for Washington State to claim full victory, but at least they have their second win in a row in a court that, as I said, is often overturned.
Well, Dan, thanks so much. As we say, this is playing out right now in real time on both coasts of the United States. Let's go back here in Washington to John Roberts at the White House. Any new developments, John? I
got a little bit of information about what's going on at this moment from Sean Spicer, who says that the White House counsel's office, led by Don McGahn, is considering its options on what to do next. We don't know what those options will be at this point. Clearly, they're in consultation with people over at the Department of Justice and the newly minted Attorney General Jeff Sessions. You would think, and Charles Krauthammer spoke to this earlier, that they would have had their ducks in a row, knowing that the ruling could go one way or another. But I think what they want to do, because this was a lengthy ruling with a lot of arguments in it leading to the conclusion, they want to see what the judge argued, what the judges argued at least, so that they could formulate a response to that. But at this point, we still don't know which way they are going to go, but they're burning the oil here in the White House counsel's office together with the Department of Justice, Chris, just to try to figure out which way they're going to go forward on this.
John, thank you, and obviously keep us in touch with any new developments. Meanwhile, as we've been pointing out, the Justice Department now, just today, got its first head. The Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, just confirmed and sworn in today. And the Justice Department has just reacted to the ruling. Correspondent Rich Edson is at the State Department with more on that reaction. Rich.
Well, Chris, the State Department and officials here are looking to the Justice Department and looking to the legal system as for what they do, because remember, it is the State Department that implements this, and the Justice Department saying, quote, the Justice Department is reviewing the decision and considering its options. And so what the State Department has done is it's looked at this ruling and it will continue to implement as per the ruling. So if you are a foreign national from those 7 countries that were included in the executive order, you may still apply for a visa to come to the United States, and they will consider it just as they had. Now, there are other provisions within the executive order that weren't addressed in certain places within the order, but when it comes to visas and immigrating to the United States, this is what the State Department is looking at. Initially, the State Department had provisionally revoked 60,000 visas from people coming to the United States. Once that decision came out last week, the initial one from the district judge, that's when the State Department then moved forward and canceled those initial provisions. So those visas were still good so long as they weren't physically destroyed at a border point, and then those folks could still reapply. So from here, it's looking to the judicial system, and that's what we have from State, Chris.
Thanks so much, Rich. Let's bring in our chief judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano, again. Let's talk about the Supreme Court. You know, we're kind of assuming, Judge, that, well, there are 4 liberals, there are 4 conservatives. It's a tie court. There's no 5th vote. This will be a tie, and therefore the Ninth Circuit Court ruling upholding the temporary restraining order will stand. Is that your way of looking at it, or do you think that the court might actually get a majority one way or the other on this?
If I were advising Attorney General Sessions or privileged to advise the President, I would suggest that the ideological breakdown with which we're all familiar of 4 against 4 might not necessarily pan out in this particular case, because the intellectual leap taken by the Ninth Circuit is so extraordinary that I don't think the Supreme Court wants other circuits to be able to follow suit. You might very well get Justice Elena Kagan, for example, who did not hesitate to slap down President Obama at least 3 or 4 times, even though she worked for him in the West Wing. She was a Solicitor General in his Justice Department, and then he appointed her to the Supreme Court. I think she would be as outraged as I have been from my knowledge of her thinking and my familiarity with her, as outraged as I have been with the Ninth Circuit flipping standards on its head, saying the president had to show irreparable harm rather than the states having to show irreparable harm, suggesting, intimating, and actually applying some rejudgment in lieu of the president. He didn't come to the same conclusion we did as to the severity of the danger of human beings from these countries. I think you would find that perhaps Justice Kagan might say, who cares what you think of the president's thinking? That's not your job. So my advice to them would be, go for it, because you might be surprised. It might not be a 4-4 split.
Let's bring in our panel to close this hour out. Thank you so much, Judge, for your analysis throughout the evening. And Julie, when I interrupted you, I want to go back to this question of how this fits in to President Trump's agenda. James Rosen was saying, well, it's not the repeal of Obamacare. No, it's not. But for 3 weeks in, this isn't just optics. This is politics, and it speaks very much to the issue of the momentum that this president has, which it seems to me has come to a full stop right now.
And particularly for this White House, which looks at momentum in terms of actual speed of implementation. They took great pride in the way that the first week actually went, being able to roll out executive order after executive order. So to be essentially halted on this, Charles raised an interesting point earlier that has gotten lost in this whole discussion. If you take Trump at his word, the reason he instituted this ban was because he felt like vetting from a lot of countries in the Middle East was not tough enough. It is possible to tighten vetting without doing this order. And I think this is a really interesting question that we need to push him on. If that is really your focus, will you walk away from this executive action and just focus on tightening the vetting program? If he does that, you could see him moving on pretty quickly to healthcare, to tax reform, and not getting bogged down in this kind of legal argument. But he's also a very prideful person. He's someone who doesn't like to lose, and you could also see him wanting to push this forward and prove his administration right in the courts.
I have to say, Lisa, if you believe him at his word, and usually he does what he says, the first words in his first tweet, his first reaction were, "See you in court."
Yeah, it looks like he wants to fight this out. And I should have mentioned, too, earlier in the hastiness aspect that I had brought up, of also moving forward without Attorney General Sessions in place as well, first and foremost. But I also think there is a danger for the Democratic Party to overplay their hand here. I mean, obviously, I see their point in trying to exploit this as a political win. But you don't quite know how this is going to play out in the courts as well. And I think right now they've really been overplaying their hand on a gambit of issues and essentially, posing President Trump at every single move. And they do have the obstacle of looking at a Senate map in 2018, you've got 10 vulnerable Democrats in states that President Trump won, 5 of those in states that he won by double digits. We're talking 42 points in a state like West Virginia. So I do think as much as the Democratic Party wants to try to exploit this as a political win, they also have to be careful in their opposition to him looking ahead of that 2018 map.
Charles, your thoughts about this, how it fits in with the overall Trump agenda, and should he walk away from this, either one, just saying let's go vet, or two, we're going to fight it out in the district court, which will take weeks or months, and going ahead with the rest of his agenda?
Let me just say that despite Chuck Schumer plagiarizing me, I do believe that the president is completely within his rights in issuing an order that is lawful and legal. And under normal circumstances, I think he'd be vindicated by the Supreme Court. I think Judge Napolitano may be right that there will be at least one liberal on the court who will support him, because I think it's pretty obvious, and it would be embarrassing if the liberals on the court all unanimously opposed him. But as a pure political, tactical issue, I do think that you can let this thing go. There are two parts. There's the vetting and there's the moratorium. The moratorium is incidental and temporary. You let that go, you go back to the district court, it's dragged out. The moratorium would expire anyway in 90 days. You do the vetting. You get Giuliani or somebody else to put together a program and have it done within the 90 days, and then you move on.
And your thoughts about how much this is hurting the rest of his agenda, and if he continues the fight, how much it soaks up, as it did for this hour, all of the oxygen?
I think it's a matter of personal pride. The guy's a winner. He doesn't like losing. But I think it's a losing proposition to run after this unless you think you can win with the Supremes. You may or may not do, and you want to roll the dice. But otherwise, let it go. Escape from it. You're not getting anywhere on this. You got a huge agenda. You're on a roll. Don't mess it up.
Thank you, panel, for an extraordinary evening. We've got special report for tonight, a night full of breaking news. I'm Chris Wallace here in Washington. Our coverage of the Ninth Circuit Court decision continues now on the first 100 days, a very eventful day in those first 100 with Martha MacCallum, her guest, counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway. That's up next.